Welcome. You have now entered the Freedom First podcast,
where we have conversations with some of the most interesting human beings on the planet.
People who live and breathe a Freedom First mentality. Our guest today is an amazing human being, one of the most touching, emotional, and thought-provoking conversations I've had a chance to have. She's an Australian-born journalist who is a foreign policy expert, a war correspondent, war crimes investigator, and a best-selling author. She was an investigative and international affairs and war journalist for Fox News Digital for over 14 years, where she focused on warfare, terrorism, and crimes against humanity. She has worked on the front lines of several major war zones and covered humanitarian and diplomatic crises in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Iran, Turkey, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Burma, Russia, Africa, Latin America, and other areas. Her globally spanned coverage in the form of thousands of print articles and essays has included exclusive and detailed interviews with numerous captured terrorists, as well as high-ranking government, military, and intelligence officials and leaders from all sides. She spent considerable time embedded with U.S. and foreign troops, conducted extensive interviews with survivors of torture, sex slavery, and forced child jihadist training, refugees, and internally displaced people to communicate the complexities of such catastrophes and war crimes on local populations. Her columns have been featured in Wall Street Journal, obviously Fox News, and other different types of academic journals and publications. As I mentioned earlier, she has her latest book is called Only Cry for the Living, Memos from Inside the ISIS Battlefield, which is just emotionally driven, heartfelt. I mean, some of these stories will make you cry, make you sick to your stomach, but they're real, and that's what she is. She's a real journalist who, gets straight to the story. She's on the ground. She just returned from Afghanistan a few weeks ago, and she was in Afghanistan during the Taliban takeover of Kabul and the country, and the United States withdraw from the country. So she was on the ground. She's seen everything happening and what was going down. She was talking to, Taliban fighters. She was talking to the local Afghan people and understanding what they're thinking, what they're going through, their social and psychological kind of mindset and aspect. And that's what she's been doing for decades, going to these war zones, going to these places where, people are, this is what they know. This is their way of life. She's talked to these different terrorists and asking them, what makes you join? What makes you want to be a part of this, or what's forced you into it? And sometimes it's, that was their option, right? And that was the path they chose. So just an amazing conversation, amazing person, just lucky and humble and grateful to have had the chance to talk to her. And the work she's doing is incredible. So check out her books on Amazon. So many memos in here, and she shares a couple in the conversation we have today. You can follow her on Instagram, Twitter, her website. Her Instagram is at Hollie S. McKay. And I'll put that on the link in the bio. Twitter is the same, and the website is holliemckay.com. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest today, Miss Hollie McKay. All right. Hello, Hollie. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on the Freedom First podcast. And I know you have a busy schedule and everything going on, just getting back from Afghanistan and everything else you have going on. I know working on some different projects and articles and stuff. So Thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
So on the Freedom First podcast, we do a little segment called the Freedom Minute, and this is just kind of some rapid fire questions to get fired up and just our listeners get to know a little bit about you and get like an insight into your life a little bit. So the first question is, it is called the Freedom First podcast. So what does freedom mean to you?
Freedom means to me the ability to say no. I think that oftentimes in life we feel very hamstrung to always agree to things, to say yes, or we're really told what we have to do. And I think a big part of freedom is having the ability to say no.
Awesome. Well, thank you. That's a very insightful and to the point question or answer there. So the next question I have is, obviously you've been to all kinds of different countries in the world. And what is the most beautiful place you have been to in your journey professionally?
I would say there's a province in Afghanistan called Bamiyan, and it is just absolutely exquisite. It was the first national park in Afghanistan, and it's just these incredible blue lakes. It's also where the Buddhas were blown up by the Taliban in 2001. And so you just have this very rich sort of desert historical feeling, and it's so much sort of different aspects of beauty packed into one. I would definitely have to say Bamiyan.
When did that become a national park?
I believe it was 2016.
Oh, so very, very recently then.
Yeah, it was sort of an initiative under the previous government.
Awesome. Thank you. And this is a question, I ask every guest. If you could sit down and have a conversation with anyone throughout the history of the world, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
I think I would say I would like to have a conversation with somebody living, and that would probably be right now. I think a really interesting person to speak to would be Putin.
Oh, wow. And what would you ask him?
I just think I would try to get a little bit inside his head and understand from his point of view his foreign policy goals, what he's trying to achieve in certain places, and I guess the sort of relationship that he wants or is purporting to have with the United States.
Yeah, and that's an interesting answer because obviously you have conversations with all these different type of people, even members of ISIS and different terrorist groups. So that would be an interesting conversation. How about like if you would you have a conversation with someone like a Kim Jong-un or like one of those types of people? And
yeah, for sure. There's nobody that I wouldn't have a conversation with. I think that talking to people is an incredibly important part of what we do as journalists. We are not government employees, so we really do have that freedom to talk to anyone. And I see that as being something really critical. It's not necessarily, I think, these buzzwords are often thrown around about giving people a voice or a platform, and it's not about that at all. It's really just communication with the other. And so often we like to paint our quote unquote enemies, as very one dimensional, but it's not black and white. And I think that in order for us to learn from our mistakes and really move forward and put America's interests at the forefront, we have to understand what we're dealing with and the mentality of what we're dealing with. And I think that is far too overlooked in foreign policy.
Right. And I mean, I've had some people on the guest, and one of the answers from this question was like an Adolf Hitler. And I know that's controversial, but just like you had kind of said, getting into the mentality and the psychological kind of aspect of those people, like why did you do this? What made you go in this direction? Like what caused that? So interesting insight from your perspective as well. So I know you're obviously a reader, you're a writer. What is your favorite book, number one, and what would be a book you would recommend to our listeners?
Probably one of my favorite books in covering the aftermath of war, Hiroshima by John Hersey. It was written several decades after the United States dropped a bomb on Hiroshima to end the Second World War. And it's just an incredibly poignant, beautifully written, very first-hand account of going back to Japan and talking to these survivors and capturing what they experienced and what their life was like now. And it was really it really brings you into their lives, and that's something that I always really try to do with my journalism as well. I think it's really important to write from that place of humanity, and so often so much of what we see and read is very dry and often very policy driven. And I think, for me, how I like to write is very narrative driven. I like to really bring the audiences in. And so Hiroshima is a really, it's just sort of the Bible for me and what I go back to whenever I kind of get stuck. It's really an incredible book. So I would definitely recommend that. Another book that I really love is a book called Tribe by Sebastian Junger, who used to be a war reporter as well. And it's a very short read, but I think it speaks so much to not just to Americans, but to people all over the world about the things that we're missing from our lives. And he often takes some of the lessons that he's learned in these very far-flung places, which have a much more tribal mentality than we do have here in the United States, and what we can sort of glean from that, and what we can learn, and the things that are missing, and how really loneliness and that sort of lack of togetherness is something that has really fractured our society. And I think it's a really important anthropological read.
Yeah, Sebastian's work is incredible. As is yours. I love just hearing these, like you said, these personable stories, because it creates a whole different aspect. And I know I've listened to some of your podcast and work, and I know you've mentioned like when there's an attack that it's catastrophic and it kills hundreds of people, it's terrible. But when you actually get into the insight and like a family or a single person, it has a different effect on us as human beings. And, it really hits the heart of people and the minds of people.
Yeah, I think it's really important. We can, I think, desensitize ourselves when we look at just statistics, and we can forget that these statistics have names, and these names have faces. And what I try to do really is to take some of those very micro stories and stories of survivors or victims or people that have had these firsthand accounts. And I think when you take those, you can really use those to paint a macro picture in a much more personalized and relatable way.
Right. I mean, and we could go back to, the Holocaust. You see the whole event, like the over 6 million people that were mass murdered, but you start looking at all these stories, whether it's the Anne Frank's, the story or all these different stories, and it really hits home, and you get the emotions out of people and ourselves as well. So, and that's exactly what you and like Sebastian and all these people are doing. And it really brings those stories back to us here in the United States that haven't been there. And these people that, we complain about these different aspects of our life in the United States, but then you see these people and it's like, okay, shut up. You have nothing to complain about.
Absolutely.
All right, last question I'm going to ask. You've been all over the world. What's a place that gets, I guess, a wrong kind of misconception? A place that people are like scared of, but the people are beautiful, the people are kind, and it's just a beautiful place that gets a kind of a bad rap here, especially in the West.
Oh gosh, I think really that is so many of the places that I go to. I think it's always important to remember that people aren't their government. And so often when we look at countries, especially ones that are adverse to the United States, we tend to see them only through the lens of their government. And the people themselves are usually, in most times are extremely hospitable. And obviously coming back from Afghanistan, that's one that sticks out. But also one that I would also say is Russia. And I think so much of what we see, from Russia is often sort of a very distant or hard-lined people. But what I found are really warm people and really kind people. And I remember sitting at dinner one time, and people were asking me, "Is it true that Russians are always the bad guys in American movies?" And I had to stop and kind of say yes. It's sort of rare that the Russian is the good character. So it's certainly a place where I found to be, just incredibly interesting and lovely people.
That's incredible. And, I appreciate you answering those questions on the Freedom Minute. It just gives us a little bit of insight, gets us fired up into the conversation today. And thank you so much for joining us, Holly. And, looking at all your work and where you've gotten to today, obviously it's got a whole background. And for those that, don't know your background or haven't seen your work, you're from Australia, and then you moved here to the United States at a relatively young age. So going back to your childhood, where did this all start? Where did your journey begin?
I always loved to write. I grew up in a really small country towns in northern Queensland. We didn't sort of travel much as a child, but I loved ballet, and my mother put me in ballet classes really young. So it really gave me, and I went to boarding school really young as well, so I could further my ballet. And I think it really, even though that career trajectory for me seems so far removed from being a war reporter now, it really gave me the grounding that I needed to do this job. It gives you the discipline. It gives you sort of this sense of what's out there. And we studied a lot of dancing and culture and music from so many places in the world. And I really learned so much of historical moments through sort of arts and culture. And so for me, it's played a huge role in this profession, even though it seems so far removed. So I thought that was what I was going to do with my life. And I broke my ankle when I was about 18, and so I sort of had to go back and study. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I love to write, but I guess at that age, I just didn't see it as a career trajectory. I didn't understand how one would make a living doing that. So I was sort of focused more on media and communications and the arts in that world. And I ended up going to New York to finish my degree, and randomly got this internship at Fox News, which I didn't even know what it was. I was 20, and I just wanted to be in a newsroom, and I wanted to have that experience to write. And so I sort of got there on my first day, and I think the other interns all really wanted to be broadcast journalists. They all wanted to be on TV, and so we're put in different divisions, whereas for me, that was never my goal in life. I still now, TV is not something that I particularly care for that much. I really do love words. So I was put into the digital, which was very new. That was in 2006. So it was still this very new and upcoming thing. This was, pre-social media, really. And that was really the best decision that I could have made, because I was able to go out into the field and to write so much, and to sort of understand how a newsroom worked right from the very beginning. And at the end of that internship, they offered to sponsor me. So I was again very young, and it was an incredible opportunity. So I went out to Los Angeles after that, and worked for Fox out there for many years.
So you were in ballet, and I mean, you said originally, you wanted to pursue that until you broke your ankle, and everything else kind of, went its course. Obviously, you have an artistic mindset and creativity. Did that ballet and that dance, did that kind of transition you in? And a lot of those kind of those backgrounds that you have to be successful in that help you in the journalism world?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it really gave me this discipline. I think it also gave me just a different perspective, and I looked at things in a very different way than most other journalists that I knew at the time. You were able to frame things in a slightly different way, and I loved that creativity, and it's a big part of my writing now, which I like to do, is very narrative driven, is very sort of feature driven. I much prefer that style of writing, where I really get to sit with people and talk to people and really capture the essence of their story, much more than, say, breaking news, which I've done a lot of in my career, but it's not necessarily the type of journalism that I really love. I love that long form, which is, sadly, it's a bit more of a rarity now, but I do love that long form ability to be creative and to write from the heart, and to write from a first person, as opposed to everything having to be fairly dry and from a third person, as we see in most newsroom copy. So I think for me, that was just really it was a baptism by fire, going to Los Angeles and suddenly, being surrounded, and I had a column, and I was just basically told, you have to go out and find stories and do this. And I didn't know anybody, and it was incredibly terrifying. We didn't have social media in those days, so you really had to go out and interact with people. I had to go to events, I had to go and travel, I had to do dinners, I had to, do all these very draining things outside of my normal job. And really that's what I focused on, is to build that source network. And I think that's something that sadly is really missing in journalism today with young people starting out, is they tend to just sort of stop and look at Twitter. Whereas I can't, stress the importance of having that face-to-face contact and building a source network that you just never know where that's going to lead.
Yeah, I mean, even like you said, the face-to-face contact, even the writing process has at some points been lost in the social media and trying to get likes and trying to get, views on
Yeah.
everything. It's all about like, how many views can we get? What's going to get the most views?
Yeah.
So
So this sort of influencer thing, and yeah, and it's a little bit disturbing to me because
sure.
I think when you're so invested in the ego in many ways, you're never going to get to the real story. And I think as a journalist, it's always very uncomfortable for me if I become the story. That's never what you want. It's
Right.
always about writing the stories of other people. But I think we're so personality driven today that it's a bit of a shame because we've lost that real essence of storytelling and what that should be.
Yeah. I mean, and then like you said, when it becomes about you, it starts to become kind of a little weird, awkward, and that's not what you want, obviously. But those types of people the types of people like yourself are so interesting, and there's so few people I feel like that I mean, there's a lot of people that do it, but there's so few people we see that do it, because it is dangerous. You are taking a huge risk. Obviously, you're away from your family, most of your life. So, that's a huge thing, and I mean, I appreciate all that you do, and being in all these places to get us these stories, that we need, because obviously, like we see the headlines, whether it's on CNN or these different networks, we're not getting to talk to these people. You're seeing headlines. So, these stories on the ground that you could interact with personally, I mean, those hit us. Those are the stories that, we could show our kids, our students and things like that and say like, this is real. So, no, I appreciate that aspect. So you go, you're in New York, you go to LA. So you have a column, was that the column called Pop Tarts? Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so what were you doing?
So
And what are the
yeah,
stories you're covering?
that was that was obviously very entertainment driven. I did a lot of other general assignment on the side of that, but yeah, that was very entertainment driven, which I really loved, to be honest with you. People look at it, and I think there's often can look down their noses at entertainment, but for me it was an incredible entree into journalism. I was 21 years old. I had a column. I was living in Los Angeles, and really had the world at my feet, which is something that I think most people would really want. And for me, I learned a lot, but it was certainly never something that I wanted to really pursue. Um, long term. I just never had the vested interest in it. And I felt very guilty about that because here I had this dream job really that so many people would want in terms of going to, incredible events. You go to the Oscars and the Grammys and every possible party. And when you're working for a big outlet like Fox, you do have this extraordinary access of being able to sit down with a lot of A-list people and go to a lot of incredible things. And whilst I really appreciated what I could learn from that, I also, it wasn't for me. I felt very much like an outsider sort of looking in at this world that I didn't really belong in. So I think for me, I just took from it what I could. I used it to sort of harness my writing skills, and it taught me a lot in terms of really being able to understand when somebody's giving you a lot of BS, and that's something that I have to use a lot today in my career. So cutting through a lot of these layers of people, and often celebrities are often very guarded with rehearsed lines, and being able to sort of slice through that and get to the truth of a story is something that I was able to learn very young, and I'm very grateful for that. But as soon as I kind of had that opportunity, I had to forge my own path to break away from that. And I was traveling a lot and just had a very much a deep curiosity for the world and for the conflicts that were happening in these far-flung places, especially with Middle East and the Arab Spring and all the things that were happening there. And I knew that's really where my heart lied, and the sort of work that I wanted to be doing. And so I had to really go out and forge my own path to do that. And it certainly wasn't easy. I think a lot of the people looked at me like I was crazy, and a lot of the powers to be, especially at Fox, were sort of who is this girl and what does she think she's doing? She's an entertainment reporter. But I think it quickly became apparent that it was something that I was very comfortable doing, and was able to really get information out of people that a lot of others weren't. And I think when you are in those high strung situations, something is being shelled, you're being shot at, there's, you're on a crazy front line. I think the majority of people very naturally, and it's a very natural feeling, is to be afraid of that and to think, I want none of this. Whereas, if for the sort of the few war reporters, I guess, that still exist, not that you ever want to be in those situations, and you certainly should have a healthy dose of fear, but I think when you're comfortable and you're able to compartmentalize and focus, and that was just something that came very naturally to me, and that's sort of when I really felt that this was a profession that I was going to pursue.
So you go from, I remember hearing like different interviews, basically covering and hanging out at the beach house of Paris Hilton to, being in these places like Afghanistan and South Africa. So first, before we jump into transition, so you were obviously covering celebrities, entertainment. You were spending the summer like I'd heard. And how was that? So you were spending the summer you were covering different things, and you were going to these parties was it Paris's house? I'd heard. Is that correct?
Yeah, Paris's house, Paris's summer house, everybody's house. There was a Malibu beach house, and
right.
that was all really source building for me. That was all building contacts and relationships and
rapport and.
I looked at it as a bit of a circus. I was never much of a party girl, so
right.
It certainly wasn't my favorite thing to do in the world. But yeah, it was certainly again not something I ever felt that I fit into that mold by any stretch, but interesting to observe nonetheless.
Sure. So you go from the entertainment business, and you end up So how do you end up traveling to the Middle East and these countries to be a war reporter? So how did that process work? You just have to do
it. You just have to do it. I had a great mentor at Fox by the name of Dominique, who had been a war reporter for a long time, and he'd lived in Pakistan and other places. And he and I, because I traveled so much and I spoke some Arabic, and, he just sort of said, you have to go and do this if this is something that you want to do. There's no... And I tell this to other people now that are trying to get into the industry. There's no news organization is going to come to you and go, sure, here you go. We're going to give you XYZ and off you go. It's not that. The demand for it isn't there. You have to go and do it yourself. So you have to find a place, you have to find a story, you have to find your contacts, and I think you have to forge your own path into that particular niche of journalism. Nobody's going to hand it to you. And so really that's what I had to do for the first year or so until I was able to sort of, I think, get a lot of really incredible materials. I remember I traveled a lot before, but my first trip to Iraq was right at the height of ISIS. And this was before the US had even sort of gone back into Iraq. And that was very early on. And, I went and I had established contacts through friends that were in the region that sort of helped me along. And next thing you know, I was sitting down with ISIS fighters. Really, that was my first trip to Iraq. And so I sort of came back with all this material, and I said, here's some interviews with these ISIS fighters. One of them just killed 70 people. And I think, my bosses at the time were just like, how did you get that? So I think, again, it's just, you are a product of your contacts and who you know, and that's sort of something. And I worked very tirelessly to establish that before I went. I worked really just endlessly to understand as much as I could about that region of the world and sort of what that terrorist threat meant. And I studied diligently as if I was studying for an exam, and I built as many sort of contacts as I could. And then when I felt that I was ready to go and to do that and to collect, information. And it really wasn't just for story. It was for books and for sort of, I guess, my own understanding. I went and did that. And it's really the only way to begin in this sort of work.
So you just doing it. Do you remember your first, your initial kind of trip to do that type of reporting, and what it how did you pitch it to them? What were they thinking? Oh, this girl's crazy. Because I know you brought, obviously you went to Iraq and you brought those stories back. But initially, your first trip, what were they saying? And what was that first trip like?
Yeah, I think I was working I was doing some work and I was sort of going back and forth between, between Israel and Gaza and was doing some sort of research assignment there. I don't think anybody thought that I was crazy. And I think my editors knew this, knew that I was a very tenacious journalist and a very honest journalist, and was always very much endeavoring to get both sides of something. So I think, having that good footing already for many years kind of gave me the baseline that I needed. So I don't think, I certainly don't think any of my editors thought I was crazy. I just, but I had a long track record before that of doing a lot of investigative stories, of doing a lot of political stories. So I didn't sort of come out of completely left of field, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And you were obviously, if I'm not mistaken, you travel by yourself. You don't have photographers and videographers following you. Has that always been the case?
That's always been the case. This time in Afghanistan, I did have a photographer with me, which was great. So I could sort of really focus on my writing, and he took some incredible photographs. That was sort of specific to a project, but generally speaking, I always was traveling pretty much alone, and I like to go under the radar. That's the sort of journalism I prefer to do. I don't go in with security teams. I don't go in with crews. It's very much me and my notebook, and then I work with locals when I'm there. So I try to blend in. I really think that's the best way for me to go about doing my job and to get the sort of material and stories that I need. I think that if I was trying to, take, big security teams, whatever, I would end up making myself a target, which is not what I want to do. So I really like to sort of go in and really live among these communities. That's something that's really important to me.
Yeah, I mean, and it has its pros and cons, obviously, and probably as being not having a crew, you kind of mentioned a few things, but what are some of the positives of it? I mean, obviously, kind of flying under the radar a little bit.
I mean, yeah, you fly under the radar. You have a certain sense of simplicity. I can sit in the back of the car. I can pretend to be asleep at a checkpoint. I generally am raising less red flags than people, and I think it's a lot easier to be able to write and to get to the bottom of that story. I think it's a lot more challenging for my friends that are in the television world that have to go in with these big cameras and have to sort of, I think people naturally open up to you a lot more when,
Sure.
They don't have a big camera in their face, when it's just you and me sitting here having a conversation, and I've just got my notebook and we're just talking. Whereas sort of when you're going in with these camera crews, you really have to find these very specific sound bites to put a piece together. People tend to get a lot more intimidated by being on being in front of a camera as well. So there are different challenges. I'm sure a lot of my TV colleagues also look at writing as being, very much a challenge in a very different way. So I think we gravitate to what we know and what we are most passionate about. And for me, I really just love to paint a picture with words. So that's always going to be my primary approach, although I definitely dabble in other streams of media, but I just think nothing will ever replace the written word.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. Even putting a microphone in front of you changes the human psyche, right? Like, I mean, how many times have you sat down with someone and just had this amazing conversation where you might not have had you would not have had that same conversation if there's a microphone necessarily in front of you. Not because you're afraid to say anything. It's just you're more naturally comfortable. You don't have a microphone in your face or a recorder in your face. So I think, the written word, the 50 cent or dollar notepad captures a totally different story that I feel like we've lost. And, it's the amazing people like yourself that are still doing that and going to these places, because it's a whole different story when you do that. And obviously you say that every day. So.
Yeah, and just being able to capture the details, and people will speak to you in a very different way. And I can't imagine, sort of losing that intimacy.
Yeah, I mean, because what we, watching, the late, like, Anthony Bourdain, like when he went to Libya and these places with camera crews, like it was sketchy, most of the time, and they're trying to navigate, like where they're going to go next, and everything's got to be documented. So that's hard.
Yeah, it is very, very big challenge.
What's been the benefits and challenges of being a female? Number one, going over to the Middle East, and number two, being a reporter asking, not just people, but men and different terrorists that sometimes maybe look through females and maybe don't include them in that conversation. What's that whole aspect been like?
Yeah, I think it's an advantage generally because you have access to 100% of the population that my male colleagues don't have because they can't go and sit with the women the way that I can go and sit with the women. And when you're working in these places, oftentimes you are very much this arbitrary third gender where you can go and sit with the men, you know, in one room because you're not sort of treated the way that their women are treated. And then on the same token, I can go into the room, into the kitchen with the women and have conversations with them. So I think it's, I think you sort of get this sort of strangely best of both worlds in that way. But, you know, it does come with disadvantages too. You know, often when you are trying to go to the front lines or you're working in conflict areas, it definitely takes a lot more convincing, you know, when you are a woman to explain to them that you've done this many times, that you're aware of the risks, that it's all okay, because I think there's certainly, especially in the Middle East and Afghanistan, which is in Asia, is this very much ingrained, you know, a bit more sort of a patriarchal societies where their roles are to protect the women and ensure nothing happens. So for them, it's sort of a much heightened risk when a woman is sort of put in that danger area, especially a foreigner, because nobody wants anything to happen to a foreigner when you are working in these places. You know, Afghanistan, especially under the Taliban's rule, was definitely a different challenge because especially in the beginning, you know, you go weeks, months where nobody's even looking at you, nobody's acknowledging you. People are complaining that a woman is here. So it's a different set of challenges. You know, they will still eventually do the interviews with me, but they won't ever look at me. They won't acknowledge me. They won't greet me. They won't say hello to me. And so that was very jarring in the beginning. And I think at first I was trying to be sort of very respectful of their rules and the way that they perceived their interpretation of Islam. But I think very quickly I felt it was very important to assert myself much more and to make sure that even though they weren't going to greet me, that I went and I sort of stared them down. And eventually what I noticed is that most of them started to acknowledge me and to look at me. And if I stared at them for long enough, eventually they stared back. And sort of by the end of my time in Afghanistan, I just came back last week, I found that most of them were actually greeting me, which was such a huge removal from the beginning of their rule. But I also had to acknowledge that this was also the first time that they were seeing a woman really just sort of working openly in the streets as well. A lot of them had really never seen a woman aside from their mother or their sister or their daughter if they had one, and spent much of their lives sort of living in the mountains and in these very conservative and remote areas. And so suddenly, you know, this was a new thing for them as well. And so I just tried to be very mindful that as much as it was new to me, it was also new to them. But I also felt that it was important that they become accustomed to working around women and that I didn't want to be part of not normalizing that. So that's why I kind of made the decision to be very much in their face, so that they would learn that, you know, women are not going away, women are going to be working here, and it's something that they're going to have to adjust to as a government.
Yeah, I mean, and you look at these, especially rural areas right in Afghanistan that follow these, you know, Pashtunwali codes, and, you know, they're speaking Pashto, and you know, like you see these codes like Purda and you know, like women covering themselves, and, you know, kind of the woman pacing behind the man and things like that. So you've kind of seen a big transition previously where, you know, and now that you've kind of come and you look them in the face and they've said kind of, okay, we kind of respect you more, or?
Yeah, I think for them, they're the way that they'd always been taught to respect women was not to acknowledge women, to not look at women, and to them that was a sign of showing me respect. But that's, you know, very very different to sort of our view here in the West of how we respect women. But I felt that it was important that if they're going to be a government dealing with foreigners, and that it was something that they needed to learn to adjust to, you know, just a basic reading of a woman. So that was sort of how I felt that I could play a very small role in I guess educating them on what it is to be dealing with foreigners.
What's been the, I guess, the pros and the challenges of, obviously you're an American citizen, you have been for a long time, but you're from Australia and you have the Australian accent. Have you been able to kind of manipulate that a little bit? Have you been able to kind of get away with things that, maybe a natural born American wouldn't?
Sure, I think it's much easier. It's much easier being, having an Australian passport, in terms of just safety reasons, really. I think you're looked at as a lot less of a threat than you are. I think there's a lot more suspicion that would have come around me and what I was doing there if I had my American, if I was traveling on my American passport. So I think just from a safety point of view, it's much easier to be an Australian. But having said that, the Talibans were very clear in that they wanted good relations with America and that they would welcome Americans to visit Afghanistan when I sort of brought it up. So I feel more comfortable in Australian passport. However, I would still go as with an American passport as well, because again, when you're driven to do your job, you're driven to do your job.
Right. And so I know I'd seen kind of some of your stories. There's a story about the weddings that you had published recently, that the Taliban had basically kind of come in and were kind of attending and, to get a meal. What were some of those those recent stories like? That was interesting.
I think some of those little cultural stories are always interesting. Weddings are a big cultural staple in Afghanistan. It's sort of the center of life, really. Even the poorest families, they save up everything they have for these sort of weddings where thousands of people attend, and
right.
These long affairs, and a lot of used to be a lot of dancing, a lot of music, and you sort of have these lovely meals, and it's this men and women are usually always divided, but certainly that's very strict in place now with the Talibans, and there's no live music, but the women's side is allowed a DJ, is my understanding, and oftentimes the Talibans will come to these weddings. They usually notify the people in advance that they're going to be there, and the Talibans have been told that they can't just show up completely uninvited. There has to be some level of coordination, but yeah, they come for the free food. And you have to remember, a lot of these Talibans, these guys, this is also what makes them incredibly resilient, is that they haven't got a salary for 20 years.
Right.
They're not paid like the way that the Daesh or ISIS is paid. They fight, purely for the cause. And I think that's really what makes them so strong, is that they're not fighting for any salary, which is what you sort of saw with a lot of the Afghan soldiers, is that their heart really wasn't in it, but that was their only means of making a monthly income. Whereas the Talibans, they believe so purely in this ideology, and they can go days without eating. They can live in the mountains with very little, and they can operate a government on a very little overhead. So I think it speaks to the much larger picture of what makes the Taliban robust, and why they were able to sort of take back the country at such a rapid pace this year. And it speaks to, I think there's a certain sense of resilience that we often really didn't understand or didn't look at, in the Western media when we were trying to sort of understand the Taliban and understand the future of Afghanistan.
Right. And I mean, you've gotten to talk to a lot of these people, whether it is ISIS in Syria or, the Taliban in Afghanistan. Obviously, these countries, these people grow up poor, and their, fathers or, have fought in the war, whether it's, against the Russians or the Soviets or whatever it was, right? Why are these people, especially the younger people, why are they joining ISIS? Why are they joining the Taliban?
I think the reasons vary a lot. I think a lot of them come, they're oftentimes these young Talibans, they maybe they're educated up till around, grade 9 if they're lucky. And then after that, they go to a madrasa, which is a religious school. Oftentimes these were, there are many in Afghanistan, but oftentimes they were going across the border to the sort of the tribal areas of Pakistan and going to these very hardline madrasas. And then pretty much out of that is where the Talibans did a lot of recruiting. And then once they'd completed their studies there, they would then, be sort of taken into the Taliban fold and, given different assignments or sent to different places to fight. So that's often how a lot came in. Some came in, not because they they were ideologically driven by the Taliban, but their home was raided by the US or the Afghan forces, or a bomb was dropped in their village, and they saw innocent civilians die. Or a lot of the times they were, going to school or going to study, and then they were arrested and accused of being Talibans, and they were put in Bagram or another prison, for several years when they felt that they were innocent and they didn't really have any recourse for justice while they were there. So naturally, when they came out, they wanted to fight back against what they perceived to be, this sort of a very egregious injustice by sort of a foreign invaders. So they sort of, the reasons were generally very different, but I think people were very, very motivated to take up arms because the Taliban ideology really is very different from Al-Qaeda and ISIS in that it's not focused at all on creating any type of global caliphate. It's really just focused on Afghanistan, and in many ways they are isolationists. They want Afghanistan to be under their interpretation of Islamic rule, and they just don't want any interference from outside countries, and that's sort of always been very much the fundamental Taliban principle. So for them it was just they needed to push back against this foreign invasion, and that was really just their driving motivation.
Right, and like we see all these different people, and obviously, like here in the West, in the United States, like sometimes we have things to look forward to, whether it's college, and then you go to some of these, especially the tribal areas, right? That maybe these kids don't like they don't have a lot going, in the future, and they see what's going on here, and obviously they're being recruited. Is that kind of part of it too? Like especially the poorer you see in these third world countries, the easier they are, able to be recruited and things like that. Do you see that aspect of it, or?
Absolutely. There isn't really, especially when you are coming from impoverished places, and Afghanistan is a very impoverished place. There isn't a great deal of opportunity.
Sure.
At best you might be able to open a street, be a street vendor, or you might be hawking trinkets in the market, or there's just not a lot of opportunity for people in Afghanistan, especially from the very poor areas. So the Taliban, joining something like the Taliban is a respectable move, even if it doesn't make you sort of money. It's considered to be a great service to the cause of your country.
Right. So when you plan these trips, like when you just went over to Afghanistan and things, how does it come about? Like, what's the process of it? I know you have fixers and things like that. So how does that initial process? Are you doing all the legwork for it?
Yeah, I'm usually always doing the legwork. And then obviously this time with the changes that had happened, we were sort of back to square zero and trying to find a fixer that was comfortable with the Taliban, because our first fixers had left the country when it fell. So you are doing a lot of legwork. You have to have a good understanding of what you're trying to cover and what you're trying to do and achieve and the places that you want to go. And yeah, you have to, I guess, sort of put that together as best you can. And I was working with the photographer Jake Simkin, who was living in Australia, and so we just brainstormed a lot about what it is that we wanted to do, and we really thought we'd be going over there to sort of document the end of the United States and the first few months of the Afghan government having to stand on its own 2 feet. And you certainly could not have imagined the Taliban would come in so quickly, abruptly, even before the United States had left. So we have to always be ready for plan B. And then that's also an important part of the job, is to be flexible with your plans and to know that things can go pear-shaped at any moment, and you have to adapt to that. And if you are not able to adapt to that and to stay calm in those situations, you are not going to last very long in the job. So it's very important to not to panic and to really be able to think logically in those situations, because nothing ever goes the way that we want it to or think that it's going to.
Absolutely. And this last trip you've been in Afghanistan, obviously we've seen the headlines and whatnot, and we've seen that the United States pull out troops. So first question, what is your thoughts on how the United States pulled out, and secondly, what's been the experience? What have you kind of gained from these last couple months in Afghanistan as the Taliban have taken over?
I think whether we agreed with the war in Afghanistan or not, we can certainly, I think, collectively agree that the way that we left was very disappointing.
Right.
For Americans in general, it was chaotic, it was disorganized, it was downright dangerous, and I think that it's hard for me even now to sort of wrap my head around how and why that unfolded, and how our planning ability, how our intelligence, how all of that really didn't sort of kick in, and the administration made decisions that quite frankly were baffling, such as closing Bagram, the airbase, just month before the pullout, which would have made things certainly a lot easier had we kept that open. And as a result, we had that horrible attack, that ISIS attack that killed 13 Americans and 180 Afghans at the airport in that chaos. So I certainly think that should have been, handled in a much more streamlined way. And it was really a lucky dip if you got out. I know a lot of people who had their SIVs who deserved to get out, who just could never get to the gate. And I know a lot of people who didn't have the paperwork, who did nothing to serve America. And I know people, in fact, who are banned from the United States, who are now living in the United States because they were lucky enough to hustle their way through the airport and to get on an evacuation flight. So to me, there was sort of really no rhyme or reason, and it was just such disorganized chaos. It was a very dark, I think, period for America, and a very sad way to end a 20-year war that so many people had sacrificed a lot for. So I certainly didn't see much good out of that. And sorry, what was the second part of your question?
So you've been in Afghanistan for a couple of months now since the Taliban took over. We like you had said, the closing down of Bagram, and then leaving all of this military equipment, hundreds of millions of dollars of military equipment there. What's been your experience? What have you kind of learned and heard from these people since the Taliban have taken over? We talked a little bit about it a little bit ago, but what's been the basic feeling in Afghanistan?
You mean the Afghan people?
Yes, the Afghan people. Yeah.
So I think there's still this very big camp of Afghans that, are desperately trying to leave the country. And, all day I get messages on LinkedIn, on WhatsApp, on, everybody's sort of trying desperately to leave. I would say there's certainly a number of people that deserve to leave because, they do qualify for paperwork. They have done a lot to serve the United States and certainly have earned a place in leaving given their work. But, I would also say that in many ways the fear is contagious. And what I really noticed is that people, everybody would tell you their life is under threat. And quite frankly, that's just it's not true. So what we're seeing is, the Taliban certainly have done some egregious things, and there have been, isolated acts of retaliation, but they're very much the exception, not the norm. I think a lot of things were really blown out of proportion in the media. I think a lot of things were being delivered secondhand. A lot of stories were being repeated that just weren't true. There were a lot of sort of fear mongering. And I think when people see that their neighbor is scared and that their relatives are scared, then they feel that they have to be scared too. And so you sort of create this perpetual cycle. And what I would see is when I would talk to people and they say, oh, I'm under threat. I was a driver for DynCorp in 2005 for 5 months. And I would sort of say, you're not under threat. To be honest with you, the Taliban's are not going to come after you. Many times they're trying to get former government employees back into their jobs. So I think that sort of this cloud of fear has been challenging for the Afghan people to be able to sort of, I guess, accept the reality and move on with their lives. I think that generally speaking, people want to leave for economic reasons because the economy is so bad there. I think it's also very difficult for women, especially with the situation in oftentimes not being able to work, and girls' education in public schools from secondary being stopped in most provinces still, which is very concerning. So I think there are definitely cases, but overall, I would really argue that I guess sort of this sort of sense of everybody being under threat and fear, it's not the reality. And that was sort of being painted a lot. It's still being painted a lot. And I still am seeing people come to me saying, oh, I'm under threat. And then I say, well, where's the threat? And the threat is a sort of a fake letter that's being passed around on WhatsApp. I just think it's important to acknowledge that isn't quite the reality.
Going forward, what do you think the future, the next 10 to 20 years looks like in the region? And what do they need? What do the Afghans need to kind of make that change?
Yeah, I mean, the economic and humanitarian situation is absolutely devastating right now. So, and I really think that the United States and the Western world need to step up and support the Afghan people, because they've been through enough. They've been through just decades of endless war, and now especially heading into this brutal winter, when you can't feed your family, you can't get medical care. I've been to the hospitals there, and they're just babies dying on massive malnutrition, and it's devastating. And really, in large part, that comes down to the US freezing the funds in August when the Taliban took over, and all those funds, 9.5 billion, were frozen. And that is not hurting the Taliban. As I said to you earlier, they can operate under a very small overhead. It's not them who are starving. It's not their children who are dying of malnutrition, although in some cases I'm sure that is happening. But it's the Afghan people, and I really think we as Americans have a duty to support them. And unfortunately, it does bring about an uncomfortable question of how, liaising with the Taliban. But I don't think we have a very good option now, just to turn a blind eye and to walk away after, leaving the way that we did. I think that would be another very much a black eye on America's history. And I don't want to see that happen. And it's gone on for long enough. So I would like to see some more support for the Afghan people, because they desperately need it. Over 90% of the population is starving. There is no middle class anymore. People are selling their belongings in the street. There is huge unemployment problems. And the foreign aid organizations, the NGOs, have left and really haven't come back. And so the results of that are devastating. And to give you some context, when I first went there in the end of July, the Afghani was 71 cents, I think, to the dollar, and it's now over 100. That is how much inflation has happened, and that's how much their currency has fallen. And this is already a poor country to begin with. So the ramifications of that are devastating, and that will continue to spiral over the next several years if we don't do more to address that now. I think that's incredibly important. I don't see the Taliban going anywhere anytime soon. I don't see a foreign country kind of coming in to displace them. And right now, unfortunately, their women's rights record is not great in terms of education and other things. But beyond that, right now, I don't see a reason for anybody to sort of come in and try to take the Taliban out of power. They're not committing mass genocide on the people, and they are, they're not an insurgency anymore. They are trying to be somewhat of a government, for better or for worse, but these stories that we're often hearing about, these genocides happening, that they're quite frankly not true. So I think it would be far more destabilizing for anyone to sort of try to come in to take out the Taliban right now, when there isn't, I think, a just cause for that to happen. So I think the Taliban have power, and really their worst enemy is themselves. There tends to be a lot of infighting within these organizations, and you certainly see in the Taliban, you've got big schisms often between the Kandaharis and the Haqqanis and other groups that are sort of vying for power. So I think the biggest threat really, if we're going to look at a civil war or anything like that, that sort of comes from within the Taliban. Right now, I don't see any external group having that sort of power. And quite frankly, I don't want to see any more fighting in Afghanistan. I don't want to try to see any sort of armed insurgency come to take the Taliban out. I think that would just sort of create a terrible conflict, and Afghans have been through enough.
Sure. Thank you for your insight into, in Afghanistan, and, you just obviously getting back from Afghanistan, you just have been on the ground and seen everything. So I appreciate the insight. I want to get to your book real quick.
Yes.
I have it right over here. So Only Cry for the Living. Memos from Inside the ISIS Battlefield. Quickly, I just want you to kind of, what was the process, and what kind of led you to writing the book, and just kind of the process of, initially creating the book and then publishing it at the end. So what was that process like?
So the book is very much a trajectory from, I guess, my time going back and forth many times between Iraq and a few times through Syria, between, I guess, the rise of ISIS 2014 really to the end of 2018. So it sort of covers this rise and this fall of ISIS. And again, I really tried to create or to bring to life the humanitarian stories and really cover it from every aspect, whether that be the mother in a refugee camp trying to feed her children, or the Yazidis that have been taken as sex slaves, or the Iraqi soldiers, or the Kurdish soldiers, or the ISIS fighters themselves. And I think, again, that's really important that we try to look at these things from a very individual point of view and from every perspective that we can. And that's really what I tried to do with that book. And it was really very much a labor of love. I think I collected so many notebooks from my times working there. And one day I sort of looked at these notebooks stacked up in my apartment, and I wondered what to do with them, and I really thought that the best way was sort of to put it together as a series of sort of dispatches or memos, as I've called them in the book, that can sort of bring the big picture story together through these very sort of small and individual stories. And I published that through D'Angelo Publications, a good independent publishing firm that's run by a good friend of mine, and she enabled me to sort of have the creative control and to go with a lot, I think, larger word count than most of the mainstream publishers accept these days. So it was very freeing to be able to sort of write as I saw fit without kind of heavy levels of censorship.
Yeah, and it's forwarded by Jocko. And just for people to give you, or just to give people a little insight into the book, what's one of the memos that, I know there's so many in there that touch so close, are so emotional, but what's one of the memos that is most memorable for you?
I think I spent, over that course, I spent a lot of time with the Yazidi population and really documenting their stories. There was an ethnic minority group living in Sinjar Mountain in Iraq, very peaceful, very loving people. Their religion, I guess, kind of worships a peacock angel, essentially, and it's a very ancient religion, and there's no real book behind it. It's all these sort of stories and anecdotes that are passed down from generation, and it's a very closed community. And so when ISIS came in, they looked at them as devil worshippers because they didn't worship the same God as they did. And so they took a lot of the women as sex slaves, and girls too, girls as young as 8. And these were thousands and thousands, and thousands are still missing. It was devastating, and the West's inability to protect them in any way. So there are several memos in there that deal with the Yazidi people and deal with, especially speaking to the women as soon as they'd been returned from these years as being sex slaves, and what was going through their minds. But a particularly, I think, memorable moment was when I was in Lalish, which is sort of the Yazidi temple, and it's their holy capital where they have their pilgrimages. And I was with Baba Chawish, who's their spiritual leader. And I remember, he is telling me this story about this old Yazidi woman who'd been kidnapped for so long, and that she'd come back, and they just, she'd just been rescued and brought back, and they'd taken her to the temple, and she died in the Yazidi temple. And I remember I was so highly strung and emotional from just sort of weeks on end of covering this conflict. And I just remember just crying and thinking how sad it was that she'd survived these years of brutal captivity, and only to sort of immediately die. And I looked at him, and to him that was actually a beautiful thing, because it was such a special thing to die in the temple, and such a rare thing to die in the temple, and he viewed it with a much different lens than the way that I viewed it. So I think that was just sort of a microcosm of the war and the brutality of it, but also just the different ways that we perceive, and really the ways that we deal with death, and how different they are in the West to people like the Yazidis in the Middle East.
Yeah, so everyone listening, please, it's called Only Cry for the Living. If you have a chance, get a copy of it. It's incredible, just the different memos, and one of them you just kind of heard from Holly. So thank you, Holly, for sharing that. And the last couple things I have to ask you. Number one is, we have a segment called the Freedom Fighter of the Week. And this is someone that's been inspirational, that's kind of helped you get to where you are today. Who's your Freedom Fighter of the Week, Hollie?
Oh my goodness. I will have to go with a journalist named Marie Colvin. She was a Sunday Times journalist and just incredibly tenacious about getting always to the story, about not forgetting the conflicts, not forgetting the suffering that people were going through, and really being a light in some of those incredibly dark places. And unfortunately, she was killed by the Assad regime in Syria in 2012. But she sort of always remains a bulwark of what it is to be an old school journalist in many ways, and to really to value storytelling in these far-flung places, and to bring a light. And that's what we as journalists can do. We aren't policymakers. We don't have the power to change laws or to really dramatically alter the trajectory, but what we can do is bring awareness to it. And that's something that I see as an incredibly important thing, even though it tends to be something that really is fading. I think from with the trajectory of social media, I think people think they can be very lazy and sit in newsrooms and don't have to go to these places, but I think bearing witness is something that is incredibly important.
Yeah, I mean, the craft, the artistic side of what you guys do, and the hard work of, you're on the ground going to all these places. Not only is it dangerous, but you're putting in those late nights and countless hours of writing and journalism. So what would you, and this is the last thing I'll kind of ask you, we'll leave people with, what would you kind of give to the people that maybe it's young people, maybe it's people that want to change careers, they want to go into journalism, they're passionate about it, they want to be a writer. What have you learned, and what would you kind of tell them?
Well, I certainly think passion is the number one thing. I think you have to be really all in it. It's not necessarily the profession that you're going to make a ton of money. I think if you're umming and ahhing and going, maybe I'll be a banker, maybe I'll be a journalist, go with being a banker, because to be a journalist, it's a lifestyle job. I think we're often consumed by this idea of balance, and we have to have work-life balance. And don't get me wrong, you can't be a journalist 24/7, but it's a lifestyle job. That really isn't. You have to sacrifice a lot. There really isn't, a balance in this particular type of journalism. And there are many types of journalism, but for the foreign reporting, every waking minute really has to be devoted to doing this, to studying geopolitics, to studying an area, to studying cultures, to studying languages, to trying to get yourself into a place that everybody else is trying to get out of. Requires a lot of tenacity and logistics and risk, and you don't have the backing of the United States military, and you don't have these personal security, and you don't have all these things. So you have to be very much aware of what you're doing and the sacrifices being made, and there are a lot to your personal lives. There are a lot to your family. It's often the hardest to explain to your family why you do what you do, but you have to know there is nothing else that you want to do with your life. And if you have that conviction, you will find a way to succeed. But you have to be 100% in, because you can't have your foot half in and half out. It's not that type of job.
Right, and you're the epitome of that. And I thank you for sharing that. Those words of wisdom to our listeners. And Hollie, what projects do you have coming up, in the near future, and where can people follow you and find your work at?
Well, first of all, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. I'm at Hollie S. McKay, HOLLIE SMCKAY. I also have a Substack I do some regular updates on, which is holliesmckay.substack.com. And yes, that's usually the best way to sort of contact me. I'm always working on a bunch of different projects. My next project is actually finding a home, because I've been living out of a backpack for years. So it's time to kind of get a few roots. And then once I do that, I've got a couple of ideas of places that I'd like to go to do work. I would like to return to Afghanistan in the spring, but there are a couple of places that I want to go before that. And on top of that, my photographer and I are actually doing a photo book on Afghanistan. So I'm in the process of writing. So I'm in a bit of a writing bubble at the moment, snowed in, which is kind of a nice change. So working on that, and yeah, I just think it's time to get some roots.
Thank you so much, Hollie, for joining us today. And, I appreciate your time. I know you're in the writing stage right now in a bubble, and you just got back from Afghanistan. So taking your valuable time to jump on our show from a no one from Central California, I appreciate it, and it's been an honor, it's been a privilege, and I'm so grateful.
Thank you for your support. It's really, really appreciated. And it's nice to know people out there care about places like Afghanistan and are reading the work. And that's without people like you reading it and supporting, I wouldn't be able to do this work. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. We appreciate you and your support of the show. Please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave feedback on Apple Podcasts.